The baby's wails pierced the morning air like gunshots, echoing across the silent cemetery where 50 souls stood frozen in judgment. Not one person moved toward the bundle wrapped in threadbare blankets at the foot of Martha's grave. They all watched, they all waited, until the weathered figure of Samuel Hayes emerged from behind the weathered oak, his worn boots crunching on autumn leaves. Stay with this channel as we uncover this remarkable tale of courage, compassion, and the kind of love that changes everything. They buried Martha Collins just past noon beneath the towering oak that had watched over Millbrook Cemetery for more than a century. The preacher spoke her name like it was carved in stone, cold, final, without warmth. The townspeople stood in their Sunday best, arms crossed, faces hard as the granite headstones surrounding them. Mrs. Henderson clutched her black purse with white knuckles, her lips pursed tight enough to crack leather. The mayor's wife turned her twin boys away from the sight, shielding their innocent eyes from what she considered unseemly. Sheriff Morrison stood at attention, his badge catching the October sun, more concerned with maintaining order than dispensing justice. But then came the sound that shattered their practiced indifference. A cry, soft at first, then rising with desperate hunger that made the autumn wind seem gentle by comparison. Every head turned toward the small bundle lying at the foot of the fresh grave, wrapped in a faded quilt Martha had sewn with her own hands during those long winter nights when loneliness was her only companion. The baby's tiny fists waved above the threadbare cloth, searching for comfort that wasn't coming, for arms that would never again hold her close. Martha Collins had worked the general store 6 days a week, swept the church steps every Sunday morning, and never spoke of the traveling merchant who'd given her that child. Some whispered it was the railroad foreman who came through every spring. Others claimed it was one of the seasonal workers who'd helped with the harvest, their faces changing like the seasons. But the old-timers remembered the quiet stranger who'd bought supplies that winter, the man with gentle eyes who always tipped his hat to Martha when she counted his change. Martha had carried her secret to the grave, leaving behind only whispers and a child the town didn't want to claim. The preacher cleared his throat nervously, offered another prayer to the distant sky, and stepped back as if the infant might contaminate his pressed black suit. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Someone needs to contact the county authorities." The banker nodded agreement, already calculating the cost of proper arrangements. "There are institutions," he said, the word hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Places equipped for these situations." Nobody moved, nobody knelt, nobody reached out. That's when the soft sound of spurs broke the silence. Samuel Hayes had been watching from the tray line, leaning against the ancient oak that marked the cemetery's border, his weathered hands wrapped around the brim of his hat. At 62, his face was a map of hard years, deep lines carved by prairie sun and mountain wind, scars from cattle drives and long winters, eyes that had seen too much death and not enough joy. His ranch sat 5 miles outside town, not close enough to be neighborly, not far enough to be forgotten. He was the man folks came to when their cattle got loose, or their wells ran dry, when wolves threatened their livestock or storms damaged their roofs. But he was never the man they invited to Sunday dinner, never the one they included in their social circles or sought out for casual conversation. He walked slowly through the crowd, and they parted before him like wheat before a scythe. Not from respect. Samuel Hayes was decent and reliable, but he was also different. He was alone, had been since his Sarah died in the influenza outbreak 15 years past, taking with her their dreams of children and the laughter that had once filled their small ranch house. He was a man without clear place in their ordered world, existing on the edges of their community like a ghost who occasionally materialized to help and then vanished again into the vastness of the Montana landscape. He stopped at the foot of Martha's grave and looked down at the crying child, really looked at her. The baby had Martha's dark hair, already thick and wavy, and skin the color of honey touched by summer sun. Her eyes, when they opened between sobs, were the deepest brown he'd ever seen, like creek water running over smooth stones. "She's got a name," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, cutting through the murmurs of disapproval that had begun to ripple through the crowd. The preacher shifted uncomfortably, his collar suddenly too tight. "Well, yes, I suppose the county will need to—" "Emily Rose," Samuel continued, reaching down to touch the baby's cheek with one calloused finger that had gentle spooked horses and delivered countless calves. "Martha told me once when she was buying supplies for her sewing, said it was her grandmother's name, the woman who raised her after her parents died in the river crossing." The baby quieted at his touch, dark eyes focusing on his weathered face with startling clarity, as if she recognized something in him that the others had missed. Her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength, and Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart 15 years ago beginning to crack. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "Mr. Hayes, you can't just, this isn't proper. An unmarried man has no business." "Can't what?" He lifted Emily Rose from the cold ground, cradling her against his chest with surprising gentleness, his large hands supporting her small head with the same care he'd once used to hold wounded birds. Sarah had insisted on nursing back to health. "Can't do what none of you would? Can't show mercy to a child who never asked to be born into your judgment?" Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the tension crackling through the morning air. "Now, Samuel, there are procedures, legal processes. The county will need to find proper placement for the child." "County's 3 days away by hard riding," Samuel said, already walking toward his horse, a steady bay gelding that had carried him through countless storms. "Baby needs feeding now, needs warmth, needs someone to care if she lives or dies." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, settling Emily Rose securely in the crook of his arm, adjusting his coat to shield her from the cool October breeze. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he gathered the reins with one hand, his movements economical and sure. "Martha Collins was a good woman," he said, looking back at the grave where fresh earth lay mounded over her simple wooden coffin. "Worked harder than most, judged less than all of you combined, deserved better from this town than whispers and shame. Her daughter deserves better too." With that he touched his heels to his horse's flanks and rode away, leaving behind 50 faces flushed with shame and a cemetery that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, too full of their own moral failures. Dr. Williams was the first to break the silence, his medical bag clutched in arthritic hands. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I suppose someone should check on them both, for the child's health, you understand." But they all understood it was for more than that. They understood that Samuel Hayes had just shown them what courage looked like, and they'd been found wanting. The Hayes Ranch had never known the sound of laughter until Emily Rose arrived, but by Christmas it echoed from every room like music Samuel had forgotten existed. He'd converted the small room next to his bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle from oak and pine with hands that remembered crafting toys for the children he and Sarah had dreamed of having. The cradle was a masterpiece of simple beauty, carved with horses and stars and all the hopes he'd buried with his wife. Samuel learned to warm milk without scalding it, testing each drop on his wrist the way Dr. Williams had taught him during one of his increasingly frequent medical checkups. He mastered the art of changing diapers without fumbling, though Emily Rose seemed to find great amusement in his initial attempts, gurgling with laughter at his muttered curses when the pins wouldn't cooperate. He discovered he could sing lullabies in a voice rough from years of calling cattle across vast pastures, old songs his own mother had sung, melodies that seemed to calm the baby when winter storms rattled the windows. The town watched from a distance as small towns do, with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and grudging admiration. Dr. Williams made weekly house calls under the pretense of monitoring the baby's health, but really to satisfy the overwhelming curiosity of his wife and her sewing circle. What he found surprised even him. Emily Rose was thriving in ways that defied conventional wisdom about child-rearing. She was bright-eyed and alert, clearly bonded to Samuel, reaching for him when others held her, settling immediately when she heard his voice. "She's growing strong," he reported back to the eager faces at church socials. "Samuel's doing right by her. Better than right, if I'm being honest. That child is loved, and it shows in every inch of her." But not everyone was pleased by this unexpected development. Mrs. Henderson organized the Ladies' Auxiliary into action like a general marshalling troops for battle. She wrote stern letters to the county seat, demanding immediate investigation into what she termed an improper living arrangement. She whispered at church socials about unseemly situations and what decent people might think, gathering allies among the more conservative members of the congregation. She even went so far as to visit the ranch herself one bitter February morning, arriving with 2 other ladies to assess the situation and offer their services as more appropriate caregivers. Samuel met them at the door with Emily Rose in his arms, the baby dressed in a hand-knitted sweater that Mrs. Patterson had secretly left on his doorstep. Emily Rose was babbling happily, her chubby hands reaching for the icicles hanging from the porch roof, fascinated by how they caught and scattered the morning sunlight. "Ladies," Samuel said politely, not inviting them in. "Something I can help you with?" Mrs. Henderson drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable when righteousness filled her lungs. "Mr. Hayes, we've come out of Christian concern for this child's welfare. A growing girl needs feminine influence, proper guidance in domestic arts, moral instruction from those equipped to provide it." Emily Rose chose that moment to clap her hands and crow with delight at a cardinal that had landed on the porch railing, its red feathers brilliant against the snow. Samuel smiled down at her, and the warmth in his weathered face was unmistakable. "She seems happy enough to me," he said simply. "Happiness isn't everything," Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "There are proprieties to consider, social expectations. What will people say when she's older? What kind of marriage prospects will she have, raised by a man alone?" Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I reckon Emily Rose will make her own choices about marriage when the time comes. Right now she needs love and care, both of which she's getting plenty of." "But Mr. Hayes," one of the other ladies interjected, "surely you can see this isn't natural. Children need mothers. Children need people who love them unconditionally," Samuel interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "Emily Rose has that. What she doesn't need is a bunch of folks who turned their backs on her at her mother's funeral, suddenly deciding they know what's best." The ladies departed in offended silence, but their campaign continued with renewed vigor. Letters were written, meetings were held, and slowly but surely, pressure began to build from sources Samuel couldn't easily dismiss. Meanwhile, Samuel taught Emily Rose to recognize the sound of different birds, to feel the difference between rain clouds and fair weather in the wind's subtle shifts. He carried her in a sling while he tended his small herd, talking to her about everything and nothing, how grass grew differently near the creek because of the richer soil, how to tell if a horse was favoring one hoof by watching its gait, why some storms brought blessed rain while others brought devastating hail that could destroy a season's work in minutes. Emily Rose listened with the serious attention of someone much older, her dark eyes following his gestures, her small hands reaching out to touch whatever captured her interest. When spring arrived and the wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, Samuel would sit with her among the lupines and Indian paintbrush, teaching her the names of colors she couldn't yet say but seemed to understand in some deeper way. By her first birthday, Emily Rose was walking unsteadily around the ranch house, chattering in her own language that Samuel had learned to interpret with surprising accuracy. She could say "Papa" clearly, a word that never failed to make his chest tight with emotions he'd thought were buried forever. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the porch and would crawl to the window to watch for his return from checking the cattle. When thunderstorms rolled across the plains, she would curl against his chest while he hummed old songs, completely unafraid because his presence meant safety. The town's attitude began to shift, slowly and almost imperceptibly. Children would wave to Samuel when he came to town with Emily Rose perched in front of him on his saddle, and he would tip his hat gravely in response. Shopkeepers began to smile when Emily Rose babbled at them from Samuel's arms, and more than one slipped a piece of candy or a small toy into Samuel's purchases when they thought no one was looking. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished with her crusade, and neither were the forces she had set in motion. 6 months after Emily Rose's first birthday, County Inspector Harrison arrived in Millbrook with official papers, legal authority, and the full weight of institutional righteousness behind him. He was a thin man with pale eyes and soft hands, wearing a city suit that had never known honest work, and carrying a leather satchel that contained forms, regulations, and the power to tear apart the only family Emily Rose had ever known. Mrs. Henderson had finally gotten her way. Samuel was feeding Emily Rose her breakfast at the kitchen table when he saw the official buggy coming up the drive, dust clouds marking its approach like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Emily Rose was 18 months old now, sitting up in the high chair he'd built for her, attempting to feed herself oatmeal with more enthusiasm than accuracy. She had Martha's dark hair tied back with a ribbon Mrs. Patterson had given her, and she was chattering in the mixed language of toddlers and ranchers that she'd developed under Samuel's care. "Mr. Hayes," Inspector Harrison said after Samuel opened the door, standing stiffly on the porch with his satchel clutched like a shield, "I'm here about the child." Samuel looked back at Emily Rose, who had managed to get oatmeal in her hair and was now clapping her sticky hands with delight at her accomplishment. She caught sight of the stranger and immediately reached for Samuel, her small arms stretching toward him with complete trust. "What about her?" Samuel asked, lifting Emily Rose from her chair and settling her on his hip, grabbing a damp cloth to clean her face with practiced efficiency. The county has found proper placement for her. A good Christian family in Denver, the Weatherbys. They're well established, financially secure, and most importantly, they can provide what a growing girl needs: a mother's influence, proper education, social advantages that, Harrison gestured vaguely at the simple ranch house, that this environment simply cannot offer. Emily Rose dropped her wooden spoon and watched it fall to the floor, then looked expectantly at Samuel to retrieve it. It was a game they played every morning, and Samuel found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation as he bent to pick up the spoon. "She's got everything she needs right here," he said, straightening slowly, his back protesting the movement. "She's healthy, happy, loved. What more could she need?" Harrison cleared his throat and consulted his papers. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sure your intentions are honorable, but the law is quite clear on these matters. An unmarried man, living in isolation, no female relatives to provide guidance, it's simply not appropriate for raising a young lady. The child needs proper moral instruction, domestic training, preparation for her future role in society." Emily Rose began to fuss, sensing the tension in Samuel's body, if not understanding the words being spoken. Samuel began the gentle bouncing motion that always calmed her, humming under his breath, one of the lullabies that had become their evening ritual. "The Weatherbys are prepared to take custody immediately," Harrison continued, his voice taking on the officious tone of someone accustomed to having his authority unquestioned. "They've been approved by the territorial board, they attend church regularly, and Mrs. Weatherby has experience with children. Tomorrow morning I'll return with the appropriate paperwork to collect the child and transport her to her new family." Samuel's jaw tightened, and Emily Rose looked up at him with concerned eyes, her small hand patting his cheek in the comforting gesture she'd learned from watching him soothe frightened animals. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. "Then I'll return with Sheriff Morrison and a court order. Mr. Hayes, please understand, this isn't personal, it's about what's best for the child. She deserves opportunities, education, a chance at a proper life. Surely you can see that." That evening Samuel sat on his porch with Emily Rose on his lap, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold that no artist had ever quite captured. Emily Rose was trying to catch fireflies that danced just beyond her reach, laughing with pure joy each time one flickered near enough to almost touch. Her laughter was like water over stones, like wind through summer grass, like every good thing Samuel had thought was lost to him forever. He'd faced rustlers who would kill for a handful of cattle, wolves that would tear apart anything in their path, droughts that killed livestock and hope with equal efficiency, blizzards that could trap a man for weeks with nothing but his own thoughts and the howling wind. But he'd never faced losing the child who'd brought life back into his empty house, who'd taught him that love could survive the deepest grief and bloom again in the most unexpected places. Around him the night sounds of the ranch settled into their familiar rhythm, cattle lowing softly in the distance, the hoot of an owl hunting mice in the barn, the gentle nickering of his horses in their corral. These were the sounds Emily Rose had grown up with, the lullaby that sang her to sleep each night. Tomorrow, if Harrison had his way, she would fall asleep to the sounds of a city she'd never seen, in the arms of strangers who knew nothing of her mother's courage or her guardian's devotion. Samuel held her a little tighter and made a decision that would change everything. Word spread through Millbrook the way wildfire spreads through dry prairie grass, fast, hot, and impossible to contain. By dawn, Samuel's ranch was surrounded, but not by county officials with legal papers. Instead, he woke to find his yard filled with neighbors, some he barely knew, others he'd helped through difficult times without ever asking for thanks in return. Dr. Williams stood at the front of the group, his medical bag in one hand and his church hat in the other, his face set with the determination of a man who'd seen too much injustice in his long years. Behind him were families Samuel had helped during harsh winters, men whose cattle he'd pulled from frozen ponds, women whose children he'd searched for when they wandered too far from home. Mrs. Patterson was there with a basket of fresh bread, her eyes red from crying but her chin set with resolve. Even Tom Murphy, the blacksmith who rarely spoke to anyone, stood holding a carved wooden horse he'd finished just that morning. Sheriff Morrison was there too, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, clearly torn between his official duties and his personal convictions. He'd known Samuel Hayes for 20 years, had seen him risk his own life more than once to help others, had watched him grieve his wife with quiet dignity and emerge from that grief as a better man, not a bitter one. "Samuel," Dr. Williams called out as Samuel emerged from the house with Emily Rose in his arms, her dark hair braided with the care of someone who'd learned such feminine arts through necessity and love. "We need to talk." Samuel stepped onto his porch, taking in the sea of faces, some sympathetic, some determined, all focused on the small child who babbled happily at the unexpected crowd, waving her chubby hands at people she recognized from their occasional visits to town. "Morning, folks," Samuel said carefully, his voice carrying across the yard. "Something I can help you with?" Mrs. Henderson pushed forward from the back of the group, her face flushed with righteous anger. "Mr. Hayes, I hope you understand that what's happening here is for the child's own good. We cannot allow sentiment to override proper—" "Ma'am," Dr. Williams interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered half the babies in the county and buried their grandparents. "With all due respect, we didn't come here to speak for you." The crowd murmured agreement, and Mrs. Henderson's face grew redder, but she found herself effectively silenced by the wall of disapproval surrounding her. Dr. Williams turned back to Samuel, his weathered face creased with something that might have been regret. "Some of us have been doing considerable thinking these past months, about Martha Collins, about this baby, about what's right and what's legal, and how sometimes those aren't the same thing at all." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward reluctantly, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "County inspector's waiting at the hotel, Samuel. Says he needs to conduct a final assessment of the child's living conditions before making his report to the territorial board." "What kind of conditions would those be?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well," Dr. Williams said, allowing himself a slight smile, "I suppose he'd need to see evidence of proper medical care, community support, stable environment, moral guidance." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. All the things that make a proper home for a growing child. That's when Sarah McKenna, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward with a basket covered in gingham cloth. "I brought fresh bread for Emily Rose," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And some of those molasses cookies she likes so much." Tom Murphy held up the wooden horse he'd been carving, its mane and tail meticulously detailed, its legs positioned in a perfect gallop. "Finished this yesterday morning," he said gruffly. "Figured the little one might enjoy it." One by one, the neighbors came forward with gifts, hand-sewn clothes from the women who'd quietly been making them for months, carved toys from the men who worked with their hands, books from families who believed education was important, regardless of who provided it. They arranged themselves on Samuel's porch and in his yard, like an extended family gathering, like people who belonged together despite their differences. When Inspector Harrison arrived an hour later in his official buggy, expecting to find an isolated old rancher and an improperly cared-for child, he instead discovered what looked like a community celebration. Emily Rose was being passed from arms to loving arms, cooed over by grandmothers who spoiled her shamelessly, entertained by older children who'd made the trip from town specifically to play with her. "Mr. Hayes," Harrison said slowly, climbing down from his buggy with obvious confusion, "this is unexpected." Dr. Williams stepped forward before Samuel could respond, his medical credentials lending weight to his words. "Inspector Harrison, is it?" "I'm Dr. Williams, the local physician. I've been monitoring this child's health and development since she came into Mr. Hayes's care 18 months ago." He pulled out a small notebook filled with careful observations. "She's thriving in every measurable way, physically, mentally, emotionally. Her motor skills are advanced for her age. Her verbal development is excellent, and her social adaptation is remarkable. Any medical professional would tell you she's receiving exemplary care." Sheriff Morrison nodded reluctantly. "From a legal standpoint, there's been no complaints, no problems, no concerns about the child's welfare raised by anyone with actual knowledge of the situation. The community has been fully supportive of this arrangement." "More than supportive," added Mrs. Patterson, bouncing Emily Rose on her hip while the toddler grabbed playfully at her silver hair. "We've been blessed to watch this little angel grow up among us. She's brought joy to all our lives." Harrison looked around at the gathered crowd, then down at Emily Rose, who was giggling as Charlie Peterson's oldest boy made funny faces at her. The inspector's expression was troubled, clearly struggling between his official duty and what he was witnessing with his own eyes. "I'll need to file a comprehensive report," he said finally. "The Territorial Board expects detailed documentation of living conditions, care standards, community integration." "Of course," Dr. Williams said smoothly. "We're prepared to provide any documentation you require, character references, medical records, educational assessments when she's older. Whatever the Territorial Board needs to understand that this child is exactly where she belongs." Harrison spent the rest of the morning interviewing neighbors, inspecting the ranch house, observing Emily Rose's interactions with Samuel and the community members. What he found was impossible to argue with: a child who was clearly thriving, a man who dedicated his life to her welfare, and a community that had embraced them both with genuine love and support. By afternoon, Harrison was packing his papers back into his leather satchel, his official mission effectively completed. "I'll file my report within the week," he told Samuel, shaking his hand with something that might have been respect. "Based on what I've observed here, well, let's just say the Territorial Board values stability and community support above all other considerations." As the inspector's buggy disappeared down the dusty road, the gathered neighbors lingered in Samuel's yard, reluctant to end what had become an impromptu celebration. Children played games while adults shared stories and laughter, the kind of easy companionship that Samuel had forgotten was possible. Emily Rose moved from person to person like a small ambassador, chattering in her developing vocabulary, her happiness infectious and complete. "Samuel," Dr. Williams said as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in their evening colors, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have stood up 18 months ago, should have supported you from the beginning instead of waiting until crisis forced our hands." Samuel shook his head, watching Emily Rose attempt to feed grass to Tom Murphy's patient draft horse. "No apologies needed, Doc. What matters is what happens from here forward." "What happens," said Mrs. Patterson firmly, "is that this little girl grows up knowing she's loved by an entire community. What happens is that we all do better by each other from now on." As the neighbors gradually departed, calling out promises to visit soon and invitations to Sunday dinners, Samuel found himself alone on his porch with Emily Rose, just as they'd been so many evenings before. But something fundamental had changed. They were no longer isolated, no longer fighting their battles alone. They were part of something larger, something that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Emily Rose fell asleep in his arms as the first stars appeared, her small hand clutching the wooden horse Tom Murphy had made for her. Samuel carried her inside to her cradle, tucking her in with the quilt Martha had sewn and the blessing of a community that had finally remembered what truly mattered. Emily Rose Hayes, for that was her legal name now, officially recorded in the territorial records with Samuel listed as her guardian and the full support of Millbrook's leading citizens, started school in the fall of her 6th year. She could already read simple books, having spent countless evenings with Samuel sounding out words by lamplight. She could count to 100 in English and knew basic arithmetic from helping calculate feed costs and cattle prices. Most remarkably, she possessed an intuitive understanding of animals and weather patterns that impressed even the most experienced ranchers. Miss Sarah Anderson, the new schoolteacher fresh from the Teachers College in Denver, had heard the stories about Emily Rose before the girl ever set foot in her classroom. She'd been prepared for challenges, for a child who might struggle socially or academically due to her unusual upbringing. Instead, she found herself teaching a bright, confident, and remarkably well-adjusted young girl who approached learning with enthusiasm and treated her classmates with the kind of natural kindness that couldn't be taught. "She's exceptional," Miss Anderson reported to Dr. Williams during one of his regular visits to check on the school's health conditions. Not just intelligent, but emotionally mature in ways that surprise me daily. She mediates disputes between other children with wisdom beyond her years, and she has this remarkable ability to make everyone feel included. Emily Rose had indeed inherited the best qualities of both her parents, Martha's gentle strength and intelligence, and whatever qualities her unknown father had possessed that had first attracted Martha's love. But she'd also developed characteristics that were uniquely her own, shaped by Samuel's patient guidance and the community's collective embrace. At home, Emily Rose helped with ranch chores appropriate to her age and size. She gathered eggs from the henhouse Samuel had built for her 7th birthday, fed the orphaned calves that occasionally needed bottle raising, and learned to read the sky for weather signs with an accuracy that impressed neighboring ranchers. Samuel taught her to ride with the same patience he'd shown when teaching her to walk, starting with gentle lessons on his oldest mare and gradually building her confidence and skill. But Samuel also understood that Emily Rose needed experiences beyond ranch life. He made sure she attended every church social, every school program, every community gathering. He bought her books from the traveling merchant who came through twice a year, including volumes of poetry and adventure stories that fed her growing imagination. When a traveling theater troupe performed in the church hall, Samuel paid for the best seats and watched Emily Rose's face light up with wonder at the magic of live performance. The community that had rallied to save Emily Rose from removal continued to embrace her as she grew. Mrs. Patterson taught her needlework and cooking, skills Samuel couldn't provide despite his many capabilities. Dr. Williams let her observe his work when appropriate, fostering an interest in healing that would serve her well throughout her life. The schoolmaster, Mr. Peterson, recognized her academic gifts and provided her with additional books and challenges to keep her growing mind engaged. By her 10th birthday, Emily Rose had grown into a lovely child with Martha's dark hair and eyes, but with a confidence and joy that her mother had never quite possessed. She moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had never doubted her place in it, never questioned whether she was wanted or valued. The love that had surrounded her from the moment Samuel lifted her from Martha's grave had created a foundation strong enough to support whatever dreams she might choose to pursue. On Emily Rose's 16th birthday, Samuel gave her a letter that Martha had written before she died, a letter he'd kept safe all these years, waiting for the right moment when Emily Rose would be mature enough to understand its full meaning and implications. The envelope was yellowed with age and sealed with wax that had cracked over the years. Emily Rose's name was written across the front in Martha's careful script, the letters slightly faded but still legible. Samuel watched nervously as Emily Rose opened it with trembling fingers, uncertain how she would react to words from the mother she'd never known, but whose love had shaped the very circumstances of her rescue. "My dearest Emily Rose," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means Samuel Hayes kept his word to me, as I knew he would. I knew him to be a man of honor long before I ever had cause to speak to him directly. We talked only a few times, but in those brief conversations I saw something in him that this town has overlooked, a capacity for love that survives even the deepest grief. I am writing this as you grow within me, and I am already so proud of the strong heartbeat I feel, the way you respond to music and laughter, the way you seem to settle when I read aloud in the evenings. You are wanted, my darling girl. You are desperately, completely wanted, even if the circumstances of your coming are not what this town considers proper. I have asked Samuel to care for you if anything should happen to me, not because I have no other options, but because I have watched him with injured animals, with lost travelers, with anyone or anything that needed gentleness. I have seen him grieve his wife with dignity and emerge from that grief as a better man, not a bitter one. I trust him with my most precious treasure, you. By the time you read this, you will have lived a life I can only imagine. I pray it has been filled with love, with laughter, with the kind of security I never knew as a child. I pray you have learned to see yourself through eyes that love you, not through the judgment of those who would diminish your worth because of circumstances beyond your control. You are my heart walking outside my body, Emily Rose. You are proof that love can triumph over fear, that hope can survive in the darkest places, that God's grace works through the most unexpected vessels. Never doubt your worth, never apologize for your existence, never let anyone convince you that you are anything less than a miracle. With all my love, now and always, Mama. Emily Rose looked up from the letter with tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. She had grown up knowing she was loved, but reading her mother's words made that love tangible in a new way, connecting her not just to Samuel, but to the brave woman who had chosen life for her daughter even when that choice came with overwhelming challenges. She knew, Emily Rose whispered, looking at Samuel with wondering eyes. She knew you would take me. She planned for it. Samuel nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. She was braver than any of us gave her credit for. She loved you enough to ensure you'd be safe, no matter what happened to her. That evening, Emily Rose stood on the porch of the only home she'd ever known, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow, she would begin her final year of school. The following spring, she planned to attend the Teachers College in Denver with the full support and financial backing of not just Samuel but several community members who had watched her grow and wanted to invest in her future. She thought about Martha, about the courage it must have taken to face pregnancy and childbirth alone in a judgmental community. She thought about Samuel, about the instant decision he'd made to step forward when no one else would, about the patient love that had shaped every day of her life. She thought about the community that had initially failed both Martha and her baby, but had eventually found the wisdom to embrace what they had almost lost. Behind her, Samuel was cleaning up after dinner, humming one of the old lullabies he used to sing to her when she was small. The sound still made her smile, as it always would. Tomorrow, she would help him with the fall cattle roundup, just as she had for the past several years. Next week, she would teach the younger children at Sunday school, sharing her love of learning with the next generation. Next month, she would help organize the Harvest Festival that had become an annual celebration of community spirit. But tonight, she was simply Emily Rose Hayes, standing on the porch of the ranch where a crying baby had found her home, watching the stars emerge in a sky vast enough to hold every story, every love, every choice that echoes through generations. The lonely rancher hadn't just saved one child that day at the cemetery. He demonstrated to an entire community what love looked like when it moved beyond comfort zones, what courage meant when it required sacrifice, what family could become when it was built on choice rather than obligation. And in the quiet of the Montana evening, with the wind whispering through the cottonwoods and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, that lesson lived on, as the best lessons do, in the love that passes from one generation to the next, creating ripples of grace that extend far beyond anything one person could imagine when they first decide to step forward into the unknown territory of the heart. 25 years later, Dr. Emily Rose Hayes returned to Millbrook to take over Doc Williams' practice, bringing with her a husband who appreciated small-town values and 2 children who would grow up hearing the story of their mother's extraordinary beginning. The ranch Samuel had left to her remained in the family, managed by her husband, while she healed the community's bodies and souls with the same gentle strength that had first drawn Martha to trust Samuel Hayes with her most precious treasure. The cemetery had grown over the years, but Martha's grave remained carefully tended, marked now with a proper headstone that read, "Martha Collins, beloved mother, her courage lives on." Beside it, when his time came, Samuel Hayes was laid to rest with a marker that simply said, "A man who stepped forward when it mattered most." On quiet evenings, Emily Rose would sometimes visit those graves with her own children, telling them the story of how love had triumphed over judgment, how one person's courage could change the course of multiple lives, how family wasn't always about blood, but always about choice. The children would listen with the serious attention of those who understand they're hearing something important, something that will shape how they see the world and their place in it. And the wind would whisper through the cottonwoods, carrying forward the echo of that long-ago day when a baby's cry pierced the silence and a lonely rancher stepped forward to answer it, proving that sometimes the most profound acts of love begin with the simplest decision to care about someone who has no one else. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more heartwarming stories of courage, compassion, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people to change the world, one act of love at a time.